The morning sun cast long shadows across the New Mexico desert as walked along the railroad tracks, his weathered boots crunching on the gravel. At 62, the Apache man had learned to find opportunity where others saw only waste. His keen eyes spotted what he was looking for: discarded railroad ties, old fence posts, and scattered pieces of wood that the railway company had left behind after their latest maintenance work. Bent down and picked up a piece of oak that had been used as a crosstie. The wood was solid despite its rough appearance, darkened by years of supporting heavy trains but still strong at its core. He ran his calloused fingers along the grain, feeling for soft spots or rot. Finding none, he added it to the growing pile he had been collecting for the past 2 hours. 3 miles away, Thomas Richardson sat on his ranch house porch, sipping his morning coffee and watching his cattle graze in the distance. The 55-year-old rancher owned one of the largest spreads in the county, with over 2,000 head of cattle and vast stretches of prime grazing land. His great-grandfather had established the ranch in the 1880s, and Thomas took pride in continuing the family legacy. As he sat there planning his day, Thomas noticed a figure moving along the railway line that bordered his property. Curious, he reached for his binoculars and focused on the distant man. Through the lenses, he could see someone systematically gathering pieces of discarded wood, carefully examining each piece before either keeping it or setting it aside. Had been making these early morning trips to the railroad for 3 weeks now. His small adobe house on the Apache reservation needed repairs, and like many of his neighbors, he had limited resources. The roof leaked in 2 places, and the front porch sagged dangerously where the support beam had rotted through. Rather than let his home deteriorate further, had decided to take matters into his own hands. The reservation had a small lumber yard, but the prices were beyond what could afford on his fixed income from his job at the Tribal Cultural Center. His monthly check barely covered food and utilities, leaving nothing for home repairs. So had developed his own solution. He would build what he needed from materials others had thrown away. Back at his house, his workshop occupied a small shed behind his home. The space was cramped but organized, with hand tools hanging neatly on the walls and a sturdy workbench his father had built 40 years earlier. Had inherited his woodworking skills from his father and grandfather, both of whom had been skilled carpenters who could make beautiful furniture from the most basic materials. Spread his morning's collection across the workshop floor and began planning. The railroad ties could be cut and shaped into new support beams for his porch. The smaller pieces could be used for reinforcing joints or creating braces. Nothing would go to waste. That was the Apache way his grandfather had taught him. Thomas Richardson finished his coffee and decided to drive along the fence line to check on his cattle. As his pickup truck bounced over the rough ranch road, he found himself thinking about the man he had seen collecting wood. There was something purposeful about the way the stranger had worked, not like someone just scavenging randomly, but like someone with a specific plan. When Thomas reached the section of fence closest to the railroad, he parked and walked over to where he had seen the wood collector. The area had indeed been picked clean of the better pieces of lumber, but whoever had been there had been selective. The rotten and damaged wood remained, while only the sound pieces had been taken. Spent the afternoon working in his shed, using hand tools to clean and shape the railroad wood. He had no power tools, couldn't afford them, but his skill with hand planes, chisels, and saws was considerable. Each piece of rough lumber was gradually transformed, revealing the beautiful wood grain underneath the weathered exterior. As worked, he thought about the history contained in each piece of wood. These railroad ties had supported countless trains carrying goods and passengers across the Southwest. They had witnessed the growth of the region, the movement of people seeking new opportunities. Now they would have a second life supporting his home. The work was slow but satisfying. Had learned patience from years of traditional Apache crafts where rushing led to mistakes and waste. Each cut had to be precise, each joint carefully fitted. With limited materials, there was no room for error. By evening, had prepared enough lumber to begin repairing his porch the next day. He cleaned his tools and swept the workshop, taking satisfaction in the neat piles of prepared wood. Tomorrow he would start the actual construction, beginning with removing the old, rotted support beam. Thomas Richardson spent his evening reviewing ranch accounts in his study. The numbers were good, cattle prices were strong, and the ranch was having a profitable year. As he worked, his mind kept returning to the image of the man collecting railroad wood. There was something about the careful, methodical way the stranger had worked that reminded Thomas of his own grandfather, who had built much of the original ranch with his own hands. The next morning began the careful work of removing the rotted porch beam. The structure was more damaged than it had appeared from the outside, and he realized he would need more lumber than he had initially planned. The support posts were also showing signs of rot where they met the ground, and the floor boards would need to be replaced as well. Thomas decided to ride his horse along the fence line that morning instead of driving. The gelding needed exercise, and Thomas enjoyed the slower pace that allowed him to really observe his land. As he rode toward the railroad boundary, he wondered if he might encounter the wood collector again. Sure enough, as Thomas crested a small hill, he could see a figure working along the tracks. This time, instead of just watching from a distance, Thomas decided to ride over and introduce himself. Something about the man's industrious attitude had impressed him, and Thomas was curious about what project required so much salvaged lumber. Was examining a particularly promising piece of oak when he heard horse hooves on gravel behind him. He turned to see a well-dressed man on horseback approaching. The rider had the look of prosperity, good boots, quality hat, and a horse that spoke of careful breeding and feeding. Thomas pulled up his horse a respectful distance away and touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "Morning," he called out. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I've seen you working along here for several days and got curious about what you're building." Straightened up and returned the greeting with a slight nod. "Good morning. I live on the reservation." He gestured toward the wood at his feet. "I am repairing my home with what the railroad has left behind." Thomas dismounted and ground-tied his horse. "Tom Richardson, I own the ranch on the other side of this fence." He looked at the collection of lumber had gathered. "You've got a good eye for sound wood. Most people wouldn't know which pieces are worth taking." Smiled slightly. "My grandfather taught me to see what wood can become, not just what it appears to be." He picked up the oak piece he had been examining. "This was a bridge support before it was a railroad tie. The grain is straight and strong. It will make a good beam for my porch." The two men talked for a few more minutes about the quality of different woods and the challenges of building with salvaged materials. Thomas was impressed by his knowledge and his obvious skill in working with wood. As their conversation continued, Thomas learned more about the scope of his project and the careful planning that went into each trip to collect materials. When they parted ways, both men carried with them a sense of mutual respect, appreciated that the rancher had taken the time to stop and talk rather than just driving by with suspicion. Thomas found himself thinking about the ingenuity and determination it took to rebuild a home one piece of salvaged wood at a time. That evening made good progress on his porch repair. The new support beam fit perfectly, and the structure felt solid for the first time in years. As he worked by lamplight, carefully fitting each piece, felt the satisfaction that came from honest work and resourceful problem-solving. Thomas Richardson spent his evening on his own porch, looking out over his prosperous ranch and thinking about his conversation with. There was something admirable about a man who could take discarded materials and turn them into something valuable through skill and hard work. It reminded Thomas of the stories his grandfather used to tell about the early days of the ranch, when every nail and board had to be carefully planned and nothing could be wasted. Over the following weeks, Thomas Richardson found himself timing his morning rides to coincide with wood-gathering trips. What had started as simple curiosity had grown into genuine admiration for the Apache man's craftsmanship and determination. Each time they met, Thomas learned something new about traditional building techniques or the history of the land they both called home. Welcomed these brief conversations. The rancher was respectful and genuinely interested in his work, asking thoughtful questions about joinery techniques and wood selection. Unlike some of the other Anglo neighbors, Thomas never made feel like he was trespassing or doing something wrong by collecting the discarded railroad materials. During one of their meetings, mentioned that he was looking for longer pieces of lumber to replace the floorboards of his porch. The railroad pickings had been slim lately, mostly short pieces that were good for braces and supports, but not long enough for flooring. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "The railroad company cleaned up pretty thoroughly last month. They hauled away most of the longer pieces." He paused, watching sort through a pile of wood scraps. "What length do you need?" Held his hands apart to show the measurement. 12 feet would be perfect, but I can work with 10. The porch is not very wide." He shrugged philosophically. I will find something eventually. The railroad workers always leave something behind. That afternoon, Thomas drove into town to pick up supplies for his ranch. On impulse, he stopped at the lumber yard and asked about 12-foot pine boards suitable for porch flooring. The yard supervisor, Bill, showed him several grades of lumber, explaining the differences in quality and price. Thomas found himself calculating how many boards would need and what they would cost. The amount was significant for someone on a fixed income, but it represented less than what Thomas spent on a single roll of barbed wire for his ranch. He didn't make any purchases that day, but he filed the information away in his mind. Meanwhile, continued working on his porch with the materials he had. The support structure was now solid and level, ready for new flooring. He had managed to find enough shorter boards to cover about half the area, carefully measuring and cutting each piece to minimize waste. The work was slow but steady, and took pride in each small improvement to his home. Thomas's wife, Sarah, noticed her husband's distraction during dinner that evening. After 30 years of marriage, she could read his moods well. "You've been quiet tonight. Something on your mind." Thomas told her about and the porch project, describing the Apache man's skill and resourcefulness. Sarah listened thoughtfully as her husband explained how was transforming discarded railroad wood into home repairs. "He sounds like a remarkable person," Sarah said when Thomas finished. "It takes real skill to build something beautiful from other people's cast-offs." She paused, considering. "You know, we have that stack of lumber in the barn from when we were going to build the new chicken coop. We never did get around to that project." Thomas looked up with interest. The previous year, they had ordered materials for a chicken coop expansion that Sarah had wanted. But other ranch priorities had taken precedence, and the lumber had been sitting in the barn ever since. The boards were high-quality pine, exactly the type that would make excellent porch flooring. The next morning, Thomas saddled his horse earlier than usual, hopping to catch at the railroad tracks. Sure enough, he found the Apache man carefully examining a pile of short boards that had been left behind by a recent track maintenance crew. "Morning," Thomas called out as he approached. "Finding anything useful today?" Looked up and smiled. "Good morning, Tom. Only small pieces today. The railroad workers are getting better at cleaning up after themselves." He gestured at the limited selection. "But small pieces have their uses too." Thomas dismounted and tied his horse to a fence post. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday about needing longer boards for your flooring." He kicked at the gravel with his boot, choosing his words carefully. "I've got some lumber sitting unused in my barn, pine boards 12 feet long, never been used. They were for a project that never got started." Straightened up, his expression careful and neutral. In his experience, when Anglo neighbors offered help, there were usually strings attached or expectations that weren't immediately clear. Thomas noticed cautious reaction and understood it completely. "I'm not looking for anything in return," he said quickly. "The lumber is just taking up space, and Sarah keeps nagging me to clean out the barn. You'd actually be doing me a favor by taking it off my hands." Studied the rancher's face, looking for any sign of deception or hidden motives. He found none. Thomas Richardson's offer seemed genuine, motivated by simple neighborly generosity rather than any expectation of return favor. "That is very kind of you," said slowly. "But I would prefer to pay you something for the lumber. I do not like to be in debt, even to generous neighbors." Thomas had anticipated this response. He had learned enough about over their various conversations to understand that the man had pride and would not easily accept charity, no matter how well-intentioned. "Tell you what," Thomas said. "I've been looking for someone who knows traditional building techniques. My grandfather built some of the original ranch buildings, and they're showing their age. The joints are loosening, and modern contractors don't seem to understand how they were put together originally. Maybe you could take a look at them sometime, give me your opinion on the best way to repair them." This offer was more acceptable, too. It framed the lumber as payment for consulting work rather than charity, allowing both men to maintain their dignity. Nodded slowly. "I would be happy to look at your buildings. Old construction techniques are becoming lost knowledge. It is important to preserve them." They arranged for to come to the ranch the following Saturday. Thomas would show him the buildings that needed attention, and afterward could take the lumber from the barn. Both men understood that the consulting was largely a polite fiction to make the lumber exchange comfortable for everyone involved, but it was a fiction that allowed them to help each other without awkwardness. That Saturday arrived at the Richardson ranch in his old pickup truck. The vehicle was well maintained despite its age, with hand-built wooden side rails that had crafted himself. Thomas met him at the ranch house and introduced him to Sarah, who had prepared fresh coffee for their morning tour. Sarah Richardson was a gracious woman who had spent her life on ranches and understood the value of practical skills. She was genuinely interested in his knowledge of traditional building methods and asked thoughtful questions about how the old-timers had constructed buildings to last through harsh desert weather. As they walked around the ranch, examined the original barn, the bunkhouse, and several outbuildings that dated back to the 1890s. His trained eye could see where the original builders had used traditional joinery techniques that were stronger than modern nail-and glue construction. "Your grandfather was a skilled carpenter," told Thomas as they stood in the old barn. "Look at these joints here. He used wooden pegs and mortise and tenon connections. This building will stand for another 100 years if the joints are properly maintained." Explained how the old joints could be tightened and reinforced without compromising their flexibility, which was what allowed the building to withstand decades of wind and weather. He showed Thomas where modern repairs had actually weakened the structure by introducing rigid materials that couldn't flex with the building's natural movement. Thomas was fascinated by his explanations. He had grown up on the ranch, but had never understood the engineering principles behind his grandfather's construction methods. Modern building had become so dependent on power tools and metal fasteners that the old skills were indeed being lost. After the tour, they loaded the pine lumber from the barn into his truck. The boards were beautiful, straight-grained, knot-free pine that would make excellent flooring. Ran his hands along the smooth surfaces, appreciating the quality of the wood. "This is much better lumber than I could afford to buy," said as they secured the load with rope. "I will build you something beautiful from these boards." Sarah Richardson had been watching from the porch, and now she approached with a thermos of coffee and some sandwiches she had wrapped up. "It's a long drive back to your place," she said too. "You might get thirsty on the way." Accepted the food gratefully. The Richardson family's kindness went beyond simple neighborliness. It reflected a genuine respect for his skills and dignity. As he drove away from the ranch, felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. Over the next week, worked on his porch flooring with new enthusiasm. The quality pine boards were a pleasure to work with, cutting cleanly and fitting together with precision. Each board was carefully measured, cut, and sanded before installation. Took his time, knowing that this flooring would last for many years. Thomas found excuses to ride past the reservation during the week, curious about its progress. Even from a distance, he could see that the porch was taking shape beautifully. The new boards created clean, straight lines that transformed the entire front of the house. By the end of the week, his porch was complete. The new flooring was level and solid, with tight joints that would keep out wind and rain. The entire structure had been transformed from a sagging liability into a solid, attractive entrance to the home. Stood back and admired his work, feeling deep satisfaction in what he had accomplished. News of his beautiful porch spread quickly through the Apache community. His neighbors had watched the transformation with growing amazement as the sagging, dangerous structure became something that looked professionally built. Word also spread about how it acquired the quality lumber through his friendship with the Anglo rancher. His next-door neighbor was the first to approach him about her own home repairs. Her kitchen window frame had been damaged in a recent storm, and the local repair estimates were beyond her budget. She had heard about skill with salvaged materials and wondered if he might be able to help. Examined his window and explained that while he could repair the frame using railroad wood, the job would require precise measurements and custom fitting. The work would take several days, but it would cost much less than hiring a professional contractor. Agreed immediately, trusting in his proven abilities. As began his repairs, other neighbors started stopping by to discuss their own home maintenance needs. The reservation housing was aging, and many residents struggled with the cost of professional repairs. Found himself becoming an informal contractor for his community, using salvaged materials and traditional techniques to solve problems that seemed impossible on limited budgets. Meanwhile, Thomas Richardson had begun implementing some of suggestions for maintaining the ranch's historic buildings. The Apache man's understanding of how wood buildings moved and aged was proving invaluable for preserving structures that had stood for over a century. Thomas found himself looking at his grandfather's construction work with new appreciation for its sophisticated engineering. During one of their regular meetings at the railroad tracks, Thomas mentioned the growing demand for carpentry services in the Apache community. Explained the challenge he was facing. While he was happy to help his neighbors, the work was becoming more than he could handle alone, especially since he was limited to using salvaged materials for most projects. Thomas listened thoughtfully as described some of the more urgent needs in the community. There was Mrs. Begay, an elderly woman whose roof leaked so badly she had to put buckets out whenever it rained. Young families were crowded into homes with damaged floors and broken stairs that were becoming dangerous for children. The reservation has a housing authority, explained, but their waiting lists are years long and their budget is always stretched thin. People end up living with problems that get worse every year because they cannot afford to fix them right away. That evening, Thomas discussed the situation with Sarah over dinner. They both admired how the Apache man was using his skills to help his community, but they could see that he was reaching the limits of what one person could accomplish with limited resources. What if we helped him get access to better materials? Sarah suggested. Not charity, but some kind of arrangement where his work could be more efficient and reach more people. Thomas had been thinking along similar lines. His ranch was profitable enough that he could afford to support community projects, and he had seen firsthand the quality of his work. There might be a way to help that would benefit everyone involved. The next Saturday, Thomas drove to the reservation to see some of his completed projects. He was impressed by what he found: homes that had been transformed from rundown to dignified through careful craftsmanship and creative problem-solving. Each repair showed signature attention to detail and his ability to make salvaged materials look like they had been specifically chosen for their beauty. At his house, Thomas examined the window frame repair that had just completed. The work was invisible unless you knew what to look for. The new frame fit perfectly with the existing structure, and the finish matched so well that it looked like original construction. "Does beautiful work," told Thomas proudly. "Before he fixed this window, the wind would blow through and make my kitchen so cold in winter. Now it is tight and warm and the glass doesn't rattle anymore." Thomas was struck by how much difference good craftsmanship could make in people's daily comfort. These were not luxury improvements, but basic repairs that affected health and safety. Quality work could transform a house from merely livable to genuinely comfortable. That afternoon, Thomas made a proposal too. The rancher offered to provide materials for community repair projects in exchange for consulting work on ranch maintenance. It would be a formal arrangement, with paid for his expertise in traditional building methods, and the payment could be made in lumber and supplies rather than cash. Considered the offer carefully. It would allow him to help more neighbors and do higher quality work, but he wanted to make sure the arrangement would be fair to Thomas as well. They spent several hours working out the details, creating a plan that would benefit both the ranch and the reservation community. Under their agreement, would spend one day each month at the Richardson Ranch, inspecting buildings, recommending repairs, and teaching ranch hands traditional maintenance techniques. In return, Thomas would provide lumber, hardware, and other building supplies that could use for community projects. The arrangement had an additional benefit that neither man had initially considered. Monthly visits to the ranch gave him opportunities to see how different construction problems were solved with adequate resources. He could observe modern techniques and tools, then adapt what he learned to work with traditional methods and limited budgets. Within a month, had completed 3 major repair projects using materials provided through his arrangement with Thomas. Mrs. Begay's roof was completely waterproofed with new shingles and flashing. A young family's dangerous front steps were rebuilt with a solid foundation and proper railings. An elderly man's sagging floor was reinforced with new support beams and level subflooring. Word of community work reached the tribal council, who were impressed by both the quality of the repairs and the innovative funding arrangement. Council members approached about expanding the program to address the reservation's most urgent housing needs. Thomas found that his investment in community repairs was paying dividends he hadn't expected. His growing reputation brought him into contact with other members of the Apache community, and Thomas began to understand his neighbors better. The reservation, which had always seemed separate from ranch life, began to feel more like part of the same community. Sarah Richardson started volunteering with the tribal health clinic, bringing her nursing skills to serve families whose homes was repairing. She discovered that housing problems often contributed to health issues. Children with asthma living in homes with leaky roofs and mold, elderly people suffering falls on broken steps and uneven floors. The partnership between and Thomas became a model for other cooperative projects between the ranch and reservation communities. Local churches began organizing volunteer work days where Anglo families would help with heavy labor on Apache housing projects, while Apache craftsmen shared traditional skills with rancher families. His workshop behind his house expanded to accommodate the increased volume of work. He built additional workbenches and storage areas for materials, always using the same careful construction techniques he applied to every project. The workshop became a gathering place where younger Apache men could learn traditional carpentry skills while helping with community repairs. Thomas was amazed by how efficiently could work when he had access to proper materials. Projects that would have taken weeks using only salvaged lumber could be completed in days with quality boards and hardware. The time savings allowed to help more families while maintaining his exacting standards for craftsmanship. One autumn afternoon, as Thomas and worked together replacing rotted sill plates in the ranch's old bunkhouse, shared his thoughts about the changes that had occurred over the past year. "When I first started collecting wood from the railroad," said, carefully fitting a new beam into place, "I was only thinking about fixing my own porch. I never imagined it would lead to all this." Thomas helped position the heavy timber while checked the alignment. "Sometimes the best things happen when people just try to solve one problem at a time," he replied. "Your porch needed fixing, my barn needed cleaning out, and somehow that became something bigger." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, both men reflecting on how their friendship had grown from a chance encounter into something that was benefiting two entire communities. The partnership had shown that neighbors could help each other across cultural and economic differences when they approached each other with respect and genuine goodwill. As winter approached, began planning for the next year's projects. The tribal council had provided him with a list of families with the most urgent housing needs, and Thomas had agreed to expand their material sharing arrangement. Together, they were developing a sustainable model for community improvement that could continue long into the future. The success of their partnership had attracted attention from other rural communities facing similar challenges, and Thomas found themselves consulting with groups across the Southwest who wanted to replicate their model of cross-cultural cooperation and resource sharing. What had begun as two neighbors helping each other had become an example of how different communities could work together to solve common problems. The first real test of Thomas's partnership came during the harsh winter of that year. A severe storm system moved through the region, bringing unusually heavy snow followed by a rapid thaw that caused flooding in low-lying areas of the reservation. Several families found themselves with seriously damaged homes just when the weather made repairs most difficult and urgent. Received a frantic call from the tribal council early on a Monday morning. The family, distant relatives of his neighbor, had lost most of their roof when a large cottonwood tree fell during the storm. The family of 6, including elderly grandparents and 3 young children, were staying with relatives, but their home needed immediate emergency repairs to prevent further damage from weather exposure. When arrived at the house, he found a situation worse than he had feared. The fallen tree had not only torn away a large section of roof, but had also damaged the supporting wall structure. Water from melting snow was already causing additional damage to the interior, and more storms were forecast for later in the week. Knew this was beyond what he could handle with salvaged materials and hand tools. The job required immediate action, substantial materials, and possibly heavy equipment to remove the tree safely. He called Thomas Richardson, hoping the rancher might be able to suggest resources or contacts who could help. Thomas arrived at the damaged house within an hour, bringing with him a chainsaw, a portable generator, and 2 of his ranch hands who had experience with emergency repairs. When he saw the extent of the damage, Thomas immediately understood that this was a crisis requiring immediate action rather than their usual careful planning. "We need to get that tree off the roof before more weather moves in," Thomas told as they surveyed the damage. "Then we can figure out what it's going to take to make the place weatherproof again." Working together, the men spent the day removing the fallen tree and covering the damaged roof with heavy tarps secured against wind and rain. It was cold, difficult work, but by evening they had stabilized the situation enough to prevent further damage. However, permanent repairs would require substantial materials and coordinated effort from multiple skilled workers. That evening, Thomas made a decision that would significantly expand their partnership. He called an emergency meeting of the local Ranchers Association, explaining the family's situation and asking for both material donations and volunteer labor to complete the emergency repairs. The response surprised even Thomas. Within 24 hours, ranchers throughout the county had contributed lumber, roofing materials, insulation, and hardware for the project. Several contractors volunteered their time and equipment, and the local lumber yard offered materials at cost. The Apache Tribal Council organized food and coordination support for the work crews. Found himself serving as the project foreman, directing a diverse crew of Anglo ranchers, Apache tribal members, local contractors, and volunteers from several churches. His expertise in traditional construction methods proved invaluable for repairing the house in a way that would preserve its structural integrity while meeting modern safety standards. The repair project took 3 days to complete, with work crews rotating to maintain progress despite the difficult weather conditions. Was amazed at how efficiently the project moved when adequate resources and willing workers came together under good leadership. The family was able to return to their home before the next storm system arrived. More importantly, the emergency project demonstrated the potential for large-scale cooperation between the ranch and reservation communities. Many of the volunteers had never worked together before, and the project broke down barriers that had existed for generations between neighboring communities. Sarah Richardson coordinated the meal preparation for the work crews, working alongside Apache women to prepare food for the diverse group of workers. The shared meals became opportunities for informal conversation and relationship building that continued long after the repair project was completed. Following the success of the house project, and Thomas were approached by the county emergency management coordinator about formalizing their cooperative model. The coordinator was interested in developing a regional disaster response program that could mobilize quickly for future emergencies affecting rural communities. Welcomed the opportunity to expand their impact, but he insisted that any formal program must preserve the personal relationships and community-based approach that had made their partnership successful. Too much bureaucracy could destroy the flexibility and trust that allowed neighbors to help neighbors effectively. Thomas agreed, but he also saw the value in having better organization and planning for future emergencies. They worked with the emergency management coordinator to develop a voluntary network of skilled workers, equipment owners, and material suppliers who could be contacted quickly when disaster struck any community in the region. The network they created became known as the Rural Neighbor Response Team, with and Thomas serving as co-coordinators for their sector of the county. The team maintained lists of available resources and skilled volunteers, but operated through personal relationships and informal communication rather than rigid bureaucratic procedures. During the spring following the house project, the network was activated 3 more times for emergency repairs. A ranch family's barn was destroyed by a tornado, requiring complete reconstruction. An elderly Apache man's house was damaged by a flash flood, needing foundation work and electrical repairs. A small rural church lost its roof to hail damage and needed emergency replacement before Sunday services. Each project taught, and the network volunteers something new about efficient emergency response and community cooperation. Its role evolved from master carpenter to project coordinator and teacher, helping other skilled workers understand how to adapt their abilities to work with limited resources and tight. Thomas found that his involvement in community projects was changing his perspective on ranch management and neighborly responsibilities. He began viewing his resources not just as business assets, but as tools that could be shared to strengthen the entire region. His success as a rancher, he realized, was connected to the of all his neighbors. The network's success attracted attention from state emergency management officials, who were interested in the model as a supplement to traditional disaster response systems. And Thomas were invited to present their approach at a statewide conference on rural emergency preparedness. At the conference, spoke about the importance of preserving community knowledge and traditional skills that could be crucial during emergencies. Many rural areas, he explained, had lost touch with the self-reliance and mutual aid traditions that had helped previous generations survive difficult times. Thomas addressed the economic aspects of community cooperation, showing how voluntary resource sharing could multiply the impact of individual contributions. A rancher's lumber donation, combined with donated skilled labor and coordinated planning, could accomplish repairs that would otherwise require expensive contractors and long delays. Their presentation resonated with rural community leaders throughout the state, many of whom faced similar challenges in maintaining aging infrastructure and responding to emergencies with limited resources. Several counties began developing their own versions of the Rural Neighbor Response Team model. Back home, continued his regular repair work for reservation families, while also training younger Apache men in traditional carpentry techniques. His workshop had become an informal apprenticeship program where tribal members could learn valuable skills while contributing to community improvement projects. Thomas expanded his ranch's participation in the network by establishing a tool library where community members could borrow equipment for home repair projects. The library was housed in a renovated barn on the ranch and was maintained by volunteers from both the ranch and reservation communities. The partnership between and Thomas had evolved far beyond their original material sharing arrangement. They had created a model for community resilience that strengthened social bonds while addressing practical needs. Their friendship had become the foundation for cooperation between communities that had historically remained separate despite their geographic proximity. As summer approached, and Thomas began planning for their most ambitious project yet. The tribal council had identified a group of elderly Apache families whose homes required extensive repairs that were beyond the capacity of individual volunteer efforts. The project would require coordinated work crews, substantial materials, and careful scheduling to complete multiple homes during the favorable weather months. Thomas worked with the Ranchers Association to organize material donations and volunteer coordination for the summer project, developed detailed repair plans for each house, training crew leaders in the specific techniques needed for each type of work. Together, they created a system for efficiently moving resources and workers between job sites to maximize productivity while maintaining quality standards. The summer repair project would test whether their community cooperation model could scale up to address larger, more complex challenges while preserving the personal relationships and mutual respect that had made their smaller projects successful. Both men understood that the project's success could influence how rural communities throughout the region approached the challenges of maintaining aging infrastructure and supporting vulnerable neighbors. The summer housing project began on a bright June morning with 12 families' homes scheduled for major repairs over the following 3 months. Had organized the work into phases, with foundation and structural repairs scheduled first, followed by roofing and exterior work, and finally interior improvements and finishing touches. The first house belonged to Bigay, a 78-year-old Apache woman who had raised 6 children in the small adobe home her husband had built 40 years earlier, had been widowed for 10 years, and lived on a small social security check that left no money for home maintenance. Her house needed new foundation support, roof repairs, and complete replacement of the electrical system. Thomas arrived early that first morning with a crew of 6 ranch hands and a truck loaded with tools and materials. Was already there with 4 Apache volunteers, including his grandson Robert, who had driven down from Phoenix specifically to help with his grandmother's house. Stood on her temporary front steps, watching the diverse group of workers organize tools and materials in her yard. She had been skeptical when first told her about the repair project, finding it hard to believe that Anglo ranchers would volunteer their time to fix Apache homes without expecting something in return. "Grandmother," Robert said in Apache, "these are good people who want to help our community, has worked with them before and they keep their promises." Nodded slowly, then approached Thomas Richardson as he unloaded lumber from his truck. "Thank you for coming to help an old woman," she said in careful English. "My house has been falling down around me for years." Thomas removed his hat respectfully. "Ma'am, it's our honor to help. Tells me this house has a lot of good years left in it with some proper repairs." The work began with careful excavation around the foundation to assess the extent of the damage. Had suspected that the original foundation stones had shifted over the decades, creating uneven settling that caused cracks in the walls and problems with doors and windows. What they found was both better and worse than expected. The original stonework was solid, built by skilled hands using techniques that had proven their worth over 4 decades. However, erosion had undermined several sections, and tree roots had penetrated between stones, gradually pushing the foundation out of alignment. Directed the crew in carefully removing the displaced stones, cleaning them, and preparing proper footings for reconstruction. The work was physically demanding, requiring precise coordination between workers to move heavy stones without damaging the house structure above. Thomas was impressed by systematic approach to the foundation repair. The Apache carpenter understood how to stabilize a building while making major repairs, using temporary supports and careful sequencing to prevent additional damage during the construction process. By the end of the first day, one complete section of foundation had been rebuilt and properly aligned. Invited the entire work crew to share a meal she had prepared, serving traditional Apache bread and stew alongside sandwiches provided by the ranch wives who were supporting the project. As they ate together in small kitchen, the workers shared stories about their own experiences with home repairs and construction challenges. Thomas learned about traditional Apache building methods, whilst Apache volunteers heard about modern ranch construction techniques. The second day brought new challenges when the crew discovered that the electrical system was in worse condition than anyone had realized. The original wiring had been installed in the 1960s and was now dangerous, with several connections that posed fire hazards. The repair would require a qualified electrician and materials beyond what had been originally planned. Called the tribal council to discuss the electrical problem, while Thomas contacted the electrician who regularly worked on ranch buildings. Within 2 hours, they had arranged for professional electrical work to be donated by a contractor who had heard about the summer project and wanted to contribute his services. The electrician, Jim Martinez, was a Mexican-American man who had grown up in a family that valued community service. He spent the afternoon assessing electrical needs and developing a plan for safe, code-compliant wiring that would serve the house well for decades to come. "This kind of project is exactly why I got into electrical work," Jim told as they planned the wiring layout. "Too many people are living with dangerous electrical systems because they can't afford proper repairs. I'm happy to donate my time when I know the work is really going to help someone." Watched the progress with amazement as her house was transformed day by day. The foundation work eliminated the chronic dampness that had plagued her for years. New wiring would allow her to safely use modern appliances. Roof repairs would end the leaks that had forced her to rearrange furniture during every rainstorm. By the end of the first week, word of the project's success had spread throughout both communities. Additional volunteers began showing up to help, including several teenagers from the local high school who wanted to learn construction skills while contributing community service hours. Found himself managing a larger and more diverse work crew than he had ever directed before. The project was successful, but it was also teaching him new lessons about leadership and coordination. Each day brought different people with varying skill levels and availability, requiring flexible planning and clear communication. Thomas took charge of logistics, ensuring that materials arrived when needed and that tools were properly maintained and organized. His experience managing ranch operations proved valuable for coordinating complex projects with multiple moving parts and changing requirements. His house was completed in 2 weeks, transformed from a deteriorating structure into a comfortable, safe home that would serve her well for many years to come. The foundation was solid and level, the roof was completely waterproof, and the new electrical system was safe and reliable. The completion celebration for his house became a community event, with families from both the ranch and reservation areas coming to see what had been accomplished and to plan for the remaining houses in the summer project. Prepared traditional Apache foods, while ranch families brought potluck dishes and musicians provided entertainment. During the celebration, spoke to the assembled crowd about what the project meant to her personally. "For 10 years I have been ashamed of my house," she said. "The leaks, the cracks, the dangerous wiring, I knew these problems were there, but I could not fix them alone. Now I have a home I can be proud of again, thanks to neighbors I didn't even know cared about an old Apache woman." Her words moved many in the crowd to tears, and several people approached and Thomas volunteering additional resources for the remaining houses in the project. The success of renovation had demonstrated what was possible when communities worked together with adequate resources and skilled coordination. The remaining 11 houses were completed over the following 10 weeks, each presenting unique challenges and opportunities for innovation. Skills as a project coordinator continued to develop as he learned to manage larger crews and more complex scheduling demands. Thomas discovered that his ranch could serve as a staging area for materials and equipment, using his buildings and land to support community projects in ways he had never previously considered. The ranch became a hub for coordination and resource distribution that benefited the entire region. By the end of August, 12 families had safe, comfortable homes that would serve them well for many years. The summer project had cost less than half what professional contractors would have charged, while providing much higher quality work than most families could have afforded through traditional means. More importantly, the project had created lasting relationships between communities that had historically remained separate. Families who had worked together on the housing project continued to support each other in various ways long after the construction was completed. His reputation as a master carpenter and community organizer had spread far beyond the local area. He began receiving invitations to consult on similar projects throughout the Southwest, sharing the model he and Thomas had developed with other rural communities facing similar challenges. Thomas found that his involvement in community projects had enhanced rather than detracted from his ranch operations. The relationships and reputation he had built through community service opened new opportunities for cooperation and mutual support that benefited his business as well as his neighbors. 5 years after first started collecting scrap wood along the railroad tracks, he and Thomas had created a sustainable model for community development that had improved hundreds of lives while strengthening social bonds across cultural and economic divisions. Their friendship had become the foundation for ongoing cooperation that continued to evolve and expand. The Apache man who had once worked alone with salvaged materials had become the leader of a regional network that could mobilize quickly to address community needs with professional quality results. The rancher who had once focused solely on his own land had discovered that true prosperity comes from the strength and of entire communities. Their story had become an example of how neighbors could work together to solve problems that seemed impossible when faced alone, proving that cooperation and mutual respect could overcome barriers that had existed for generations. What began with discarded railroad wood had grown into something far more valuable, a model for building communities that truly served all their members.